Duplicate payments. Every company has them, although they all wish they didn't. And before you say, oh, well, the vendor will return them, let me assure you, most won't. This scourge can be managed, but only if you use best invoicing handling practices. There are certain practices, sadly in use in many companies, that will actually increase the duplicate payments, the number of them. The goal, therefore, is obviously to keep that number as low as possible. But how do you do that? We'll identify several practices that no company should be using, and if you are using them, you should stop immediately. Make sure you stick around until the end when we discuss one that, at first glance, appears to be the silver bullet and solves the problem. Regrettably, it doesn't, and some still cling to it, hoping that it works. It doesn't, and I'll explain why. Hey guys, I'm Mary Schaefer, founder of AP Now, the place where you go for all the latest business intelligence if you work in, manage, or have responsibility for the accounts payable and or payment function. Alrighty, horrible practice number one. And I'm hoping that nobody listening to this is still using it, but only a few of you. And this refers to those organizations that take the approach that, hey, you get an invoice, you pay an invoice. What's the big deal about accounts payable? Well, as most everyone else listening to this is painfully aware, if you take that approach, you're going to end up paying about 25% of your invoices twice. You're going to pay the wrong price, etc. So, yeah, your accounts payable function should be a big deal, and you should be using best practices because vendors in record numbers are now sending duplicate copies of the same invoice. So, again, if you take this, you get an invoice, you pay an invoice approach, you'll be paying 25% of your invoices twice or three times in some cases. And I'm guessing that almost everyone who's listening today cannot afford to do that. Okay, so that's horrible practice number one. Horrible practice number two, there's the practice and then there's a corollary, and hopefully you're not doing each. So practice number two is not having a rigid coding standard for your folks to use when they're entering invoice data. And by the way, that should also be for when they're setting up new vendors in the master vendor file, but not having a rigid coding standard for everybody to use. That's horrible practice number two. Now, most companies do have a coding standard. I'm trying to remember what the numbers are, somewhere between 60 and 80%. But just having it is not enough. Not only do you have to have it, but you need to regularly check and make sure that everybody's using it. Because if you don't verify, little by little, mistakes are going to creep in. People are going to use their own abbreviations. They're going to decide to enter data in a way that they think is better or whatever, and then your duplicate payments will creep in after that. So horrible practice number two, not having a coding standard, and horrible practice number 2A, if you will, is having that coding standard but not verifying that everybody is using it. Alrighty. Now, before we get to the last few, if you like this episode, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We produce new content for the chapter 3 times a week. Tuesdays and Thursdays are for payment and accounts payable issues like this one. And we have fun with Wordle on Saturdays. All right. Horrible practice number 3. Relying on what we thought was the silver bullet. And I'm going to admit, I was the first one on that train, if you will. The strategy in theory seems like it should work, but in reality, unfortunately, it doesn't. And what that is taking the approach that, hey, our ERP system will not accept duplicate invoice numbers. So if it won't accept duplicate invoice numbers, well, then of course we can't make duplicate payments, and because we can't pay the same invoice twice. And that seems like it would work. However, this is the reality. Number one, it assumes that the processor who's entering the data entered the invoice number correctly the first time they entered it. And if your processes are like most processes, and like I'd be if I was entering invoice data, the invoice number is the last issue that they're concerned about. They're more concerned about, did they get the dollar amount right? Did they match it up against the right purchase order? Do they have the right vendor to make the payment to? So that's number one of what can go wrong. What goes wrong, number 2, and this is sad, but it happens, and I've heard it from numerous accounts payable departments, is that the process is going along, they process, and then, whoop, the ERP system notifies them that, hey, this invoice has already been paid, you can't process it. And they think, no, this invoice hasn't been paid. And so they force it in. They either change the invoice number, they put a space at the end of the invoice number. Just putting a space will do it. And let me tell you, if you're trying to check, it's very hard for you to see that space, or they put a dot. They put something in and they force the invoice through, and voila, there goes another duplicate payment. This happens over and over again. So relying on that, our ERP system won't take duplicate invoice numbers, in theory, works perfectly. In reality, not at all. And like I said, I'm one who fell for it. Now, there's another way that duplicate payments can sometimes sneak up, and most people don't even realize it. This has to do with timing. When an organization or a company takes on certain activities, these activities are apt to lead to situations where duplicate payment is more likely to happen. And really, you want to guard against this. We recently did a video on that. You can watch it right now using the link that will appear momentarily on YouTube and is in your show notes below. As always, we appreciate your thumbs up, your shares, your subscribes, and your comments. Good luck.